It was just a coffee. Until it wasn't. The cafe on Maple Street opened before the sun fully decided to rise. Its windows glowed warm against the pale morning, and the smell of roasted beans slipped into the cold air like a quiet invitation. Inside, people moved slowly, jackets half-zipped, eyes still heavy with sleep, hands wrapped around phones instead of hope. Daniel stood near the end of the line. His shoulders were slumped, not from the weight of his bag, but from the weight of weeks that he hadn't rested properly. He hadn't slept well in days, not because of noise, not because of nightmares, but because of thinking. Thinking about bills, about unanswered emails, about a job that once felt like a dream and now felt like a hallway with no doors. Daniel stared at the menu board without reading it. His mind replayed yesterday. The meeting that ended early. The polite smiles that felt rehearsed. The sentence his manager said carefully. "We're restructuring." Daniel knew what careful sentences meant. They meant uncertainty wearing a tie. He rubbed his face and shifted forward as the line moved. In front of him stood a young woman with her hood pulled low. Her hair was messy, like she hadn't bothered to argue with the mirror that morning. She kept checking her phone, then locking it again without reading anything. Behind Daniel, someone sighed. The cafe hummed quietly. The grinder, the milk steamer, the low music no one really listened to. When Daniel reached the counter, the bartender smiled politely. "What can I get you?" His voice felt heavier than usual when he answered. "Medium coffee, black." And she typed, "That'll be $3.75. Daniel reached into his pocket, then paused. He looked at the small board near the register that said, "Kindness starts here." Someone had drawn little hearts beside it. He didn't know why he noticed it. Maybe because everything else in his life felt calculated lately. Budgets, hours, expectations. Kindness wasn't on his list anymore. He paid, then hesitated. "Actually," Daniel said quietly. He glanced behind him at the woman with the hood. "I had hers too." The bartender blinked. "The next order." Daniel nodded. "Yeah, just put it with mine." The bartender smiled differently this time, not polite but surprised. Sure." She rang it in. Daniel tapped his card and stepped aside. He didn't turn around. He didn't want thanks. He didn't want a scene. It wasn't generosity. It was impulse. Sometimes people do small things when they don't know what else to do with the heaviness they're carrying. He waited near the counter. The woman stepped forward. "Hi," she said softly. The bartender smiled. "Your coffee is already paid for." The woman froze. "What?" "The person ahead of you covered it." She looked around, confused. Daniel stared at the pastry case like it suddenly deserved deep study. Okay," she said slowly. She moved aside, holding nothing but her phone and questions. Their drinks came out almost together. Daniel grabbed his cup. Just as he turned to leave, the woman spoke. "Excuse me." He stopped. She hesitated, like she wasn't sure whether to disturb a stranger's morning. "You paid for my coffee." Daniel nodded once. "Yeah." Her hands tightened around the cup. "You didn't have to." He gave a small shrug. It felt like it. There was a pause. Not awkward. Not rushed. The kind of pause that waits. She looked at him more closely now. The tired eyes, the slightly wrinkled jacket, the way he stood like someone balancing something invisible. Thank you, she said. Daniel smiled gently. No problem. He pushed the door open. Cold air rushed in. But before he could step out, she added, Can I ask you something? He turned back. Why? The question surprised him. Why pay? Why care? Why today? Daniel thought for a second. Because I needed to do something small that felt human. Her lips parted slightly. That answer landed differently than expected. She nodded. Yeah. She followed him outside. They stood on the sidewalk, steam rising from their cups into the pale morning. People passed them without noticing. But something quiet was happening between two strangers who weren't strangers anymore. As she finally spoke, My name is Lily. Daniel. As she took a slow sip. You know, I almost didn't come in. Daniel tilted his head. Why? As she looked at the street. At first I was just tired, then tired became empty. He didn't interrupt. I moved here 3 months ago, she continued. New job, new apartment, no friends yet. Everything looked fine on paper. She paused. But inside, it felt like I was living in someone else's life. Daniel listened. She stared into her coffee. This morning, I was standing outside the cafe thinking, what's the point of another routine day? Her voice stayed calm, but something underneath trembled. I wasn't planning anything dramatic. I just felt done trying. Daniel felt his chest grow quiet. She looked up at him. And then someone, I don't know, buys my coffee. She gave a small, almost embarrassed laugh. It sounds silly, right? Daniel shook his head slowly. No. She exhaled. It reminded me that I exist to someone, even for a second. Silence sat between them again. Not heavy. Honest. Daniel finally said. I almost didn't come in either. She smiled faintly. See. Two almost not their people, suddenly standing in the same morning. They walked a few steps together, without deciding to. Where are you headed? Daniel asked. Work, she said, or whatever version of it shows up today. He smiled. Same. They stopped at the corner. Traffic lights blinked. People rushed. But neither of them did. Lily turned to him. You didn't just buy coffee, she said quietly. You interrupted a bad story I was telling myself. Daniel felt something warm move through him. He hadn't fixed anything. He hadn't solved her life. He had just paused it long enough for light to get in. She raised her cup. To small things. He lifted his. To things that travel. They went their separate ways. But something had already followed them. Daniel walked differently now. Not faster. Not lighter. Just steadier. At work, the email arrived. Not bad news. Not great news. Just an invitation to talk. And for the first time in weeks, Daniel didn't read it with dread. Because his morning wasn't empty anymore. It had a story. Meanwhile, Lily sat at her desk and opened her notebook instead of her phone. She wrote one sentence. Today, someone reminded me that strangers can care before friends arrive. At lunch, she paid for the person behind her. At the grocery store, Daniel held the door longer than usual. Neither of them announced it. Neither of them counted it. But kindness multiplies quietly, like ripples in a cup of coffee. And sometimes, it's just a drink, until it becomes a reason to stay present. Small gestures don't look powerful, but they travel farther than we think. This is Moments and Meanings by Anne. Subscribe for more meaningful stories.